I threw my father a fancy party for his 50th birthday, and he got drunk, raised a toast and called me the biggest mistake of his life. That night I called security and kicked him out of the restaurant. My parents, John and Melissa, got married far too young, swept up in the kind of love that burns hot and fast, the kind that feels immortal when you're 20 and everything still seems possible. But within a few short years, the cracks in their foundation began to spread. They were living in a cramped apartment in Sacramento, California, juggling long hours at underpaying jobs, drowning in student loans and fighting more often than they spoke kindly to one another. The tension filled every room of that apartment like a fog they couldn't clear, arguments erupting over unpaid bills, forgotten chores, and the dreams they had already begun to abandon. Then one day my mom found out she was pregnant with me, and in a moment of fragile hope, or maybe desperation, they decided to give their marriage one more chance. They thought a baby might fix what was broken, that a new beginning might soften old wounds. But it was a mistake, one they would never admit out loud, and one that I would come to feel deeply even before I could understand why. My childhood was full of screaming matches that echoed through thin walls, accusations hurled like knives, and an unshakable feeling, buried deep but always there, that I was the reason they were still together, the thread holding two people in a marriage neither of them wanted anymore. My father would often leave the house without a word, disappearing for hours, sometimes days, returning with that same hollow look in his eyes like he'd been somewhere far away even if he never left town. My mother, tired and bitter, found comfort at the bottom of wine bottles, her slurred rants drifting into my room late at night, mixing with the sound of television static or a record left spinning too long. I lived between the two of them like a tightrope walker stretched across a chasm, never knowing which way to lean, never knowing who would erupt next. I learned how to move quietly, how to clean up the ashtrays and empty glasses, how to fold his jackets neatly when he stormed out and left them behind, how to sense the shift in my mother's tone that meant another storm was coming. I grew up between the fires, small and silent, trying to survive without being burned. By the time I turned 13, everything had finally collapsed in the way I think we all knew it would, and my parents divorced with the quiet finality of something that had been dying for years. My mom, to her credit, pulled herself together and found a job in a downtown office, clinging to routines and spreadsheets like they were lifelines, while my dad slipped further into a haze of alcohol and a revolving door of casual relationships that seemed more like distractions than connections. Every few months there was a new woman in his life, each one with a different smile and a different story, and each one came with the unspoken possibility that I might gain another, potential brother or sister, whether I wanted to or not. He treated it all like some twisted joke, always half laughing when he introduced them, never noticing the way I barely even looked up anymore. And somewhere along the way between the vodka bottles and the unfamiliar faces, he started forgetting my birthdays, not just the presents or the phone calls, but the day itself, like I had slowly slipped off the calendar of his life without him even realizing it. He never showed up to school parties or parent-teacher conferences, always too busy or too distracted, offering vague promises he never intended to keep and excuses that grew more careless with time. When the father-daughter dance came around, the one I had secretly been looking forward to despite everything, he told me flatly that he couldn't make it because he was busy helping renovate his new girlfriend's kitchen, as if laying tile for a woman he barely knew mattered more than showing up for his own daughter. I remember standing in the hallway holding the invitation, my fingers pressing creases into the paper, trying not to let the disappointment show. It was Uncle Michael, my mom's cousin, the one person who always treated me like I mattered, who stepped in without hesitation. He ironed his shirt, practiced dancing with me in the living room, and when we walked into that decorated gymnasium together, hand in hand, I felt something close to pride. He wasn't my father, but that night he was everything a father should be. Later, he introduced me to Gina, his newest girlfriend, a woman with an easy smile and a polished tone who spoke to me like I was a distant relative, not his daughter, and alongside her was her son Robin, a boy about my age who seemed perfectly at ease calling my father Dad, within weeks of meeting him. From the moment I walked into their house, it was as if they had already decided they were a perfect family, complete with inside jokes, matching routines and dinner table laughter I never felt invited to be part of. I sat quietly on the edges, watching them, feeling more like a guest than his child, like someone they tolerated instead of welcomed. A few months later, he married Gina in a modest backyard ceremony with fairy lights and wine glasses, and I wore the dress he said was fine without even glancing at it. I watched him pose for picture after picture, Gina in his arms, Robin tucked neatly beside them, relatives gathering for group shots, and not once did he ask me to join. There wasn't a single family photo with me in it at the wedding. Not one. I stood there, clutching a plastic cup of lemonade, invisible in the middle of a celebration I was never truly part of. I went to college in Seattle, deliberately choosing a city as far away from home as possible, hoping the distance would dull the ache of everything I had grown up around, and for a while it did. I breathed easier, moved through my days with a little more space, a little more silence. But everything changed when I got the call about my mom's accident, the kind of call that shatters whatever fragile stability you've managed to build. I dropped everything and rushed back, only to arrive just in time to hold her hand as the machines around her went still. She died right in front of me, and I didn't know how to breathe after that. It was the darkest period of my life, a hollow, echoing grief that clung to everything I touched. My dad came to the hospital, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wrapped his arms around me and held me while I cried. He stayed for the funeral, helped me make arrangements, stood beside me like a man trying to make amends. And for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe things would be different, that maybe this loss would wake something in him, pull us closer, show him what he still had. I thought maybe everything would change. After my mom died, he did try to be closer, and for a little while it felt like he was making an effort to reconnect, showing up more often, calling just to ask how I was, even visiting me in Seattle with Gina and Robin in tow. At first, I told myself it was enough, that maybe we were building something new out of the wreckage of everything that had come before. But as time passed and the visits became more frequent, I started to see through the carefully curated image Gina projected. She wasn't just confident or outspoken. She was a manipulator, sharp-tongued and possessive in ways that unsettled me. She made subtle jabs about women who talked too much, dressed too boldly, or laughed too loudly, and she always made sure to paint herself as the exception. She clung to my father in public, but behind closed doors, I noticed the way she corrected him, controlled his decisions, and shot him looks that were loaded with silent commands. My father, who had once been loud and unpredictable, now moved like a man cautiously navigating his own home. It became clear that whatever closeness he was offering me came with strings, and she was holding all of them. When it had been exactly 1 year since my mom died, I called my dad a week in advance and asked him if we could spend that day together, just the two of us, because I needed that quiet space, that shared grief, something honest between father and daughter to honor the woman who had raised me through everything. He agreed, gently and without hesitation, and I let myself believe he understood how much it mattered. But when the day came, he showed up with Gina sitting in the passenger seat, sunglasses on and arms crossed like she had been dragged to a place she had no business being. At the cemetery, she barely got out of the car, citing the heat and dust as reasons to stay behind, and when I walked to my mother's grave with flowers in my hands and tears already stinging my eyes, she stayed by the car fanning herself and muttering complaints loud enough for me to hear. I tried to block it out, tried to focus on my mother, but as I returned to the car, she looked at me with an exaggerated sigh and said, "You know, you're really ruining everyone's mood with all this." My father said nothing. He just looked at the ground. And in that silence I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't stand it anymore, and later that afternoon, sitting across from them at a restaurant where we were supposed to have a quiet meal in memory of my mother, I exploded. The pain and frustration that had been building inside me for years finally broke the surface, and I told her everything I had kept buried, how cruel and self-centered she was, how she always made everything about herself, how she had no right to complain on a day that wasn't about her in the first place. I didn't hold back, and I didn't regret it. Not even when the room went quiet and the people at the surrounding tables began to stare. She didn't say much, just raised her eyebrows and looked at my father with a theatrical expression of hurt, and later in the parking lot, he pulled me aside and told me I owed her an apology because she had sacrificed her day to be there. I stood there staring at him, not even sure who he was in that moment, and something cold settled in my chest as I realized he would always choose peace with her over truth with me. I did apologize, but only to end the conversation, and that was the last thing I ever forgave her for. Since then we've hardly spoken, and I have no intention of changing that. Time passed, life moved on, and I eventually earned my degree, packed up what little I had, and moved to Portland, where I started building something that felt like my own, working hard, carving out space for myself, and living with my boyfriend Harry, who brought a kind of steadiness into my life that I didn't know I had been missing. Just when I had started to believe I could leave the mess behind me, my dad called and told me he wanted to throw a party for his 50th birthday, something big and meaningful, and he asked me if I would be willing to organize it. I hesitated, remembering the last time I had tried to bridge the gap between us, but something in his voice made me say yes. I agreed to plan it, even invited Gina and Robin, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, this would be a turning point, that we could all show up, set the past aside, and finally make something whole out of the pieces we kept dragging behind us. I wanted to believe things could work out, even if I wasn't sure I still believed in them. I paid for everything out of my own pocket, determined to make the night special, booking an expensive restaurant with soft lighting and a private room, carefully curating every detail, from the menu to the guest list to the framed photos I placed on the table of my dad through the years, hoping to remind him of the life we still shared. But when the evening came, guests already seated and murmuring about his absence, my father showed up an hour late, swaying slightly in the doorway, his shirt untucked and the smell of alcohol arriving before he did. Gina trailed behind him, laughing too loudly like it was all just some adorable quirk, while Robin, older now, awkward in his fitted blazer, was guiding him by the elbow, trying to steady him as if it were normal. And in that moment, standing there watching them, I felt the careful hope I had built crumble. I knew exactly how the night would end, and all I could do was sit there in that expensive restaurant, surrounded by people trying not to look uncomfortable, knowing I had created this evening with love, and he had arrived ready to ruin it. And indeed, just as I had feared, the disaster unfolded during the toast, when my dad, glass in hand and swaying slightly as he stood at the head of the table, cleared his throat and began thanking everyone for coming, slurring his words just enough to make people shift uncomfortably in their seats. He went on for a while, rambling about the years and memories until his voice grew louder and his tone changed, and then in front of everyone he raised his glass toward Gina and Robin and thanked them for being a real family, the kind he said he had always wanted. He looked around the table with glazed eyes and said, with a bitter chuckle, that the biggest mistake of his life had been marrying my mom, because she had trapped him when she got pregnant with me. There was a pause, sharp and suffocating, before the forced laughter resumed around him, but I didn't laugh. I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in place as if I had been punched in the chest, the words echoing louder than the clinking of any glass. Then, as if everything he had already said wasn't enough, he looked directly at me, his face flushed and his words thick with liquor, and asked me to leave the party so he could continue celebrating with his family without reminders of the past. Gina let out a smug laugh, tilting her glass in my direction like it was some kind of victory toast, and Robin joined in with a grin that made my stomach turn. The entire restaurant had fallen quiet by then, with guests and staff alike beginning to glance uncomfortably in our direction, whispers spreading like ripples through the room. My hands were trembling and for a second I couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. I just stood there in the middle of the celebration I had planned and paid for, while my father erased me in front of everyone. My chest was burning with humiliation, and my vision blurred with rage, but I didn't let them see me cry. I turned to the nearest waiter, my voice low but firm, and asked him to call security. I wasn't going to be pushed out of my own life anymore. The security guards approached with quiet professionalism, gently but firmly guiding my father out of the restaurant while he protested, slurring accusations and waving his arms as if he couldn't understand why his behavior had consequences. Gina stood behind him, her face twisted in fury, and screamed that I had humiliated him, that I had ruined his night and embarrassed the only family he had left. I didn't respond. I simply turned to the remaining guests and the stunned customers at nearby tables, offered a quiet apology for the disruption, and walked over to the front counter to leave a generous tip for the staff who had witnessed more than they should have. Then I left, my heels echoing against the tile floor, my heart heavy but my spine straight. That night, my phone lit up with dozens of messages, vile, angry texts from Robin and Gina, each one more venomous than the last, accusing me of being ungrateful, of being toxic, of ruining what was never mine to begin with. My father tried to call me too again and again, but I stared at the screen until the ringing stopped. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Some doors once closed need to stay that way. A few months passed, and in that quiet space after the storm, I finally did something I had avoided for most of my life. I went to therapy. I sat in a softly lit room across from someone who didn't rush to judge or interrupt. Someone who listened while I unraveled years of pain that I had kept tightly wound inside me like a secret. Slowly, painfully, I began to untangle it all, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I could breathe without guilt pressing on my chest. I chose myself, not out of bitterness or anger, but out of the deep understanding that I deserved peace, that I deserved to be free from the burden of proving my worth to people who never saw it. I left the past behind like a skin that no longer fit, and even though it still aches sometimes, I know that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to live anyway. And no matter how painful it is to admit, I've come to understand one of the hardest truths there is. My family is not necessarily those who gave birth to me. It's those who didn't betray me. It's the people who stayed, who saw me fully, who chose me back. And that, finally, is enough.